My name is Deb Savaris and I'm the CEO for the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Aboriginal land. Here in Melbourne, I'm on the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and I welcome all of you who are on other gorgeous Aboriginal lands across the state of Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, elders from other cultures and emerging Aboriginal leaders. I'd like to welcome you all here today to a wonderful Friday afternoon webinar, Developing Effective Virtual Teams and What Does the Evidence Say to Us? This is brought to us by the wonderful Dr. Lisa Griffiths, well known to many of you because I can hear you chatting to her online. She's the Deputy Chair of the Centre's board and also is a real expert in the use of evidence. Lisa also co-lecturers, for many of you who would know, the evidence-based leadership course that's being done in partnership with the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, OzChild and the Centre. And I'm hearing fantastic results from that already in early days. I know Joe Dumped is here on the call today. People are loving that course. So now I'm going to introduce Lisa. This session today, there'll be a fantastic presentation, and after that you will go into breakouts. All of that is organised for you. But I'm going to introduce Lisa and then we're going to get into the presentation. Lisa has worked in senior executive leadership roles for over 30 years with large, diverse, complex non-government organisations for the public sector and in the community, delivering evidence-based services to the community with a focus on children and families, people with disabilities, at-risk youth and those from cultural diverse communities. Currently, she's the Chief Executive Officer with OzChild. Since joining OzChild, that organisation's gone through an incredible transformation process. The notes that I've got here, it says that, you know, you're growing rapidly, very large organisation, and has really revolutionised not just OzChild, but our sector in many ways in introducing evidence-based programs and expanding across many states in this country. Lisa is a strong advocate for what works for children and families and has led the introduction, as I said, of evidence-based models at OzChild and here in Victoria. Lisa is a strong contributor to the sector, an incredibly, not a selfish individual, a great sharer. She holds non-executive director positions on AQUA, which is the equivalent to the centre in New South Wales, and is also, as I said, on the board of my organisation. She also sits on the Ministerial Advisory Group for the Roadmap to Reform here in Victoria. Lisa received her doctorate in business leadership in 2019, focused on an evidence-based ethical leadership model for the community sector. A fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, a fellow of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. Most importantly, Lisa is a wife and a mother to 5 children and a former double Commonwealth Games medalist in judo. She's a fantastic friend and colleague, and I think you're really going to enjoy this afternoon. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Deb. That's such a lovely introduction. Really appreciate that. And it's good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have us all here today to collectively learn from the research on developing effective virtual teams, and I'm really excited to spend Friday afternoon with you all, and I hope that while you're on mute and your cameras are turned off, you've also got your popcorn and a glass of wine doesn't go astray in my mind on a Friday afternoon. Now, before we get started, I will go over a few housekeeping items because this is a bit of an interactive workshop today, though you do get a bit of downtime, a little bit of downtime to start with, so you can get as much as possible out of participating in the workshop. So the main presentation that I'm going to give is going to be for around 40 to 50 minutes, and at this time we'll be muted. And if for some reason you're not muted, please mute yourself, and yeah, feel free to turn your video off so you can put your feet up. The session will be interactive, so there will be some live polls. You won't have to come off mute or anything to do the polls. And then once we've finished the presentation and I've given you all the research, then we will go into breakout rooms after that. Now, as I said, the polls will be during the live presentation, and then when we go to the breakout rooms, I'm going to get you to actually go back on video then, because we do want to see all your lovely faces when we get into the breakout rooms. You're already randomly assigned to your breakout groups, and before, as I said, you go into them, I'll get you to put your video back on. Now, during the breakout sessions, there will be some discussion questions, and each breakout group will have a group facilitator. Now, to support each group, they will have the questions, they'll share them with you, and they'll also collate all your responses during the session. Now, your facilitators will let you know who they are when you enter the group, and they are all wonderful. Now, if during the course of the presentation you kind of think, oh, I've got a question about something that Lisa's saying there, then feel free to put it in the chat function. We'll make sure that they get picked up in the breakout groups as well. And if there isn't a question somebody can't answer, then we'll make sure to follow up. Now, at any time during the webinar workshop, you'll have the opportunity to, as I say, submit those questions as we go. But I won't be answering them when I give the presentation. We are recording, and of course we have the wonderful Centre of Excellence staff that are supporting me today in the moderation of this session. So on that note, we'll kick off. So I too, of course, want to start by acknowledging that we come together across many Aboriginal lands, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present on these lands, and acknowledge that their culture is a living one and began long before us. And may we learn from this rich culture and become better humans as a result. I also want to acknowledge all my Aboriginal colleagues joining us today, along with all the many other cultures represented, and may today's children lead us to a better tomorrow. So, as it's Friday, let's kick off with a bit of a pop quiz here, and we're going to do our first live poll. So, we're just going to have the poll come up now. You can probably see it. How many times have you been caught on mute in a Zoom call? So let's have a look at the results. And I'm looking at them too. And wow, how interesting. I would have gone certainly for 20 plus. But it seems the majority of you have only been caught stuck on mute between 1 and 5 times. So that's an interesting result. This is giving you a little bit of a flavour as to how the polls go. So it's been a crazy few months, correct? And this world has really challenged us about the way we think about things and the way we are and act as leaders. And I don't want to frame up the beginning of this workshop and welcome you all as leaders today, because you know the title of the presentation was about developing effective virtual teams. So I've made the assumption that all of you have responsibility for some people. Now in our sector, there are many things that do set us apart. And when I saw the list of people coming today, I thought, wow, what an incredibly talented, rich list of people across the sector that are joining us. And even from outside our sector too, to welcome anyone that isn't from the human services sector as well. And what I have learned in my many years of studying leadership is this particular sector, we're deeply driven by our values, and we're very relational in our leadership style. Now, as Deb outlined in her introduction, I have spent a lot of time studying leadership, in particular evidence-based leadership and management. And given that we've all been thrown into somewhat of a social experiment these past few months, where we've gone from one style of leadership of our teams to predominantly being face-to-face, to the polar opposite of being virtual, I wanted to know what the evidence says about what the most effective way is to support a virtual team. But firstly, just a quick refresher so we can all get on the same page when we're using the term evidence. So what constitutes evidence, and how do you measure its quality? So we're all going to look through the lens of evidence-based leadership this afternoon. Well, evidence comes through scientific research, organizational facts and data, benchmarking, best practices, collective experience, personal experience, intuition. This all actually counts as evidence. And all managers and leaders like ourselves base their decision on some type of evidence and data. However, we often forget to pay attention to the quality of evidence that we actually base our decisions on. And a really effective way to grow as leaders, of course, is to embrace continuous learning, and that's what we're all doing today. And this often means reinforcing what we've previously learned before, but also ensuring we have ways to test some of our assumptions that we make and have ways that we look beyond just one source of data, but look for multiple sources of evidence, and critically then appraise the evidence we find. So to assist our learning today, let's do another quick poll here. So it's coming up now, poll number 2, which is rate the reliability of these sources of evidence. Which one is the most reliable? Oof, very close between a rapid evidence assessment and the Harvard Business Review. Well, of course, for those of you that don't know, despite the Harvard Business Review having a very, very powerful brand, none of their content, would you believe, is actually peer-reviewed. So it actually doesn't have the same standards of evidence of other academic journals. And if you want to feature in the Harvard Business Review, it's more about your affiliation with Harvard. So you actually don't know the quality of evidence without really unpacking what the study may be that's in that journal. Whereas if you wanted to feature in another scientific journal, there are very strong standards of evidence that must be met, and you must have your article or your study peer-reviewed before it gets included. And if we think about Professor Blogs and wants to run a podcast, not that many of you actually did vote for the podcast, how reliable is this? Well, big ticks for you all there. When it comes down to what Professor Blogs presents and what the quality and validity of the podcast states, we have to really critically appraise those things on their merits, because they might be making claims. And at the same time, should we want to go to a webinar like you're coming to today, but run by a consulting firm, again, we have to critically appraise what they might claim. Though a word of caution is that most consulting firms often have the express intention of trying to gain business through offering you a product. Which of course leaves the rapid evidence assessment, which underpins today's presentation. And I'm glad to see that most of you, or over half of you, nearly half of you, voted for that one. So we've all been thrust into this virtual world, and we've adapted, but probably wondering, how effective are we actually being? And while it might seem sort of relatively new for us all to lead teams virtually, there actually has been a lot of research done over many years, because it's not a new area. It might be new to many organisations that are online now, and it might be new to our sector, but around the world, global entities have to run virtually all the time. So given that we, if you accept my claim that we're a very relational bunch, and our leadership reflects this, we've often predominantly relied on face-to-face meetings until we got to COVID. Now, if I was to run a poll on how much time you've saved since you've been working from home and you're not traveling, I'm sure you'd have a range of responses to that about the actual amount of time, but no doubt you'd have a range of responses about how you feel about it too. And I think it's safe to say that working under these COVID conditions, for some of us, we're going to be in this for quite some time. And if we're going to incorporate this into our business models in our organizations in a sustainable way, how are we going to do it well? And what are the things we're going to need to pay attention to? So some colleagues of mine at the Centre for Evidence-Based Management put together this rapid evidence assessment, or an REA as I'll refer to it, about developing virtual teams way back in 2014. So they did this work quite some time ago, but with the advent of COVID, they were requested by a number of organisations to update it. So I'm giving you the up-to-date research now, which includes a little bit in this COVID period. So what actually is a rapid evidence assessment? So evidence reviews come in many forms, and one of the best known is the conventional literature review. Many of you might have done one yourself, and it provides an overview of the relevant scientific literature on a topic. However, with a conventional literature review, the trustworthiness is often low because there isn't necessarily criteria for inclusion, and studies are selected on a researcher's individual preferences, and as a result, it can be very prone to bias. And this is why an REA, or rapid evidence assessment, can be far more reliable, because it has a specific research methodology that aims to identify the most relevant studies based on the topic as comprehensively as possible, and then selects the most appropriate studies explicit to that criteria. In addition, the methodological quality of the studies are included, and it's also assessed by 2 independent reviewers on the basis of that explicit criteria. In contrast to a conventional literature review, it's far more transparent, verifiable, and it's reproducible. So you can pick it up and you can do it again based on all the things I just said. So as a result, the likelihood of bias is much, much smaller. And with every RA, there is an overarching research question. In this case, as is in the slide there, the research question is what is known in the scientific literature about the attributes of an effective virtual team? And also then there's several other questions that this RA dives into. And that's what I'm going to cover off for the next sort of half an hour or so. So buckle in. So let's dive into it. And of course, a good place to start, so again, we all get on the same page. What does a virtual, what is a virtual team? And so virtual teams take many forms. They have different objectives and may solve different types of tasks. However, what they all have in common are 2 necessary elements. 2 or more people working together to achieve a common goal, and at least one of the team members works in a different location or at a different time. And because of these 2 defining characteristics, virtual teams communicate and coordinate at least partially by means of electronic media, email. Normally, most teams fall somewhere along the continuum between fully face-to-face, that's all members meet in person, or all members communicate face-to-face. Now, we were all probably in the face-to-face continuously, and then we've kind of slowly graduated to all virtual. And of course, with virtual teams, not all members work in the same location. Now, in the COVID-19 context, many teams have found this degree of virtuality rapidly increasing. Offices are closed, of course. Employees are being now forced to work from home, particularly all of those that are on stage 4. Now, I know many of you are an essential service. Well, we all are an essential service. So you can qualify through work permits to maybe go to the office, but it's not what is promoted, of course, currently. So another quick poll on this. When it comes to communication, and I say the term communication, what do you use mostly to communicate with your team? So what do you use mostly to communicate with your team right now? Do you use email? Do you text? Do you phone, or do you use a video conferencing platform? So what's your predominant go-to thing to communicate with your team members? So it's quite exciting watching the results coming in. This technology is fabulous, isn't it? I feel like I'm on a game show, and they go, oh, we'll now see who's voting for Lisa on this particular subject. So we're almost all there. What do you use mostly? So email is in the lead, that's not surprising. A few of you are on phone call. And just about to, okay. So I might finish that one there, and yeah, the winner is, unsurprisingly, email. With the video conferencing platform coming in second. Now on that, which one do you use the most? So poll number 3, which videoing conferencing platform do you use the most? So we're all on Zoom today, but there's Teams, there's Skype. I haven't used Slack or heard of Slack. Outlook 365, WebEx, think I've done a bit of WebEx, GoToWebinar, done a bit of that. Combination of all of these, none of these. Maybe use FaceTime. Okie dokie. So that was a fast and furious. Everyone's almost voted. That's great. And in the lead so far, it's looking to be Teams, and that's a really new technology, isn't it? Isn't that interesting? Okay. Well done. Teams is it. So that's really just something of interest to me. So we've all taken the virtual plunge, and our Zoom or Teams or WebEx, I think Skype extraordinaires, and we're all working now as part of a virtual team. So it may come as no surprise that this research shows that virtual teams are going to face far more challenges to stay effective than face-to-face teams. And we want to avoid that, right? That's why we're here today, as we strive to be the best leaders we can be. And of course, not all virtual teams are created equal, because challenges grow as team members spend more time working apart, and more of us work more virtually, because it's been kind of like a gradual thing as so the degree of separation expands in both, of course, as working hours change and as physical distances increases. Communicating through electronic media, so that's email and text, is actually where many of the challenges stem for virtual teams, because we tend to use it more often. And we just did a little poll there, and that sort of, bared out. And when you're actually operating virtually, by relying a little bit more on email to communicate things, team members actually end up sharing less information with each other. So you might be sending around emails, directional emails, requests for your team to do things, but it is found that teams have a harder time interpreting and understanding this information that they get via email, and they often give delayed feedback. And it may seem like it's more efficient to send emails, but often it's not. And it becomes particularly important to bear that in mind when we're not meeting regularly like we used to at the office. Further to that, email takes it harder, of course, to spot those non-verbal clues such as tone of voice, warmth, attentiveness. I was having a text chat quite recently with one of my staff members that's online now. And after about 4 or 5 rounds of sending text back to one another, we gave up. Went, my gosh, let's speak to one another, see each other face to face. And we couldn't meet in person. And then we resolved it in, I think 3 minutes flat, and all the energy that went into all the text before. So the research actually confirms the closer the medium is to face conversations, the absolute better. So teams using video conferencing, of course, fare much better than teams that just use teleconference or, as I said, emails. And for effective communication, when it's absolutely needed, technology is not going to fully ever deliver what you need. So there are some basic things that the research says we need to pay attention to when we're working remotely and virtually. So encourage the use of rich media for communication. So we are doing well. We're using Zooms, we're using Teams, we're using Skypes. That's a big tick for us. Because if you remember, not that long ago, we were using the good old teleconference, if you can remember them. And instead of phone calls when we work virtually, do try and use video conferencing as much as you can, because it does allow for that immediate feedback, personalization, and enables members to share their viewpoints and resolve differences quickly, like my example of my colleague and I. And at the same time, managers must be mindful that, of course, there's going to be these logistical and technological issues that might impact your use of video conferencing, internet going down. You might be a bit worn out by it now because there's so many of these per day. And of course, that catch cry, you're on mute. The other thing too is that COVID has really pushed us to think about how we synchronize our work schedules. And you have to think about that when managing a virtual team. So common working timeframes of when you meet is actually quite important, because our working hours now will need to expand because we've got all these other complications in working from home. So please do have flexible working practices. And some of your staff may work non-standard hours, they might do shift work, they might work in resi. So how you synchronize when you have your virtual meetings needs to be taken into account. Do your team members have young children? Are there better times to meet virtually if your team members are homeschooling? So be as flexible as you can while all of the restrictions have become rigid. Now, when we think about our own teams, they're not automatically more effective than the individual employee. There are actually two essential and related factors for your teams to reach their best potential, and that is that teams develop trust and cohesion. Now, social cohesion emerges in teams when team members like to work together, they're close, they care about one another, and they generally get along well and are friendly. And although it might not initially appear that social cohesion is directly relevant to your team's result, it is one of the most important conditions to be effective. So if you want your team to be effective, the research shows that social cohesion plays a really important part, but it actually shows an even greater part in virtual teams. So that social cohesion is more important than in actual face-to-face teams. However, social cohesion and relationship building can be so much harder to develop in virtual teams because communication through electronic media reduces social cues and requires us to build relationships. So for people who we've never met before and we've never met in person and they're working together for the first time virtually, it's going to be especially hard to develop social cohesion. And while this may apply less to teams that have had some point where we've worked together, and for most of us, we would have worked with our team face-to-face in the past, it's worth bearing in mind, of course, for new joiners who are not going to have any of the benefit of these pre-existing relationships. Now, related to social cohesion is trust, and trust in fellow team members is another important social process that makes teams effective. Trust has two elements to it. People can both know and feel they can trust in other team members. And virtual teams who are high in trust outperform teams where trust is low. And further to that, virtual teams with high levels of trust also tend to share far more information, very committed to their organizations, and collectively learn more together. And with that social cohesion, members of virtual teams will rely more on trust to get the work done and really need that to be more effective. And of course, trusting one another and team members, you need to be able to suspend your judgment about others and prevent things like misunderstandings and conflicts, because they can occur quite easily in virtual teams. And if, as I was sharing about the electronic media and email, poor communication through that medium can then compound the issues of managing a team virtually. So when team members do trust one another, they are far more readily wanting to share information, and that kind of mitigates the tendency to refrain from communicating through emails. And how many of us now send more or less emails? I've already said this. In a virtual world, focus on sending less. So looking at the research on building team cohesion and trust virtually, don't be afraid investing in team building. Might sound like a really hard thing to do, but it is possible. And if possible too, virtual teams kick off your work meetings with a face-to-face video platform session every week, whatever your chosen video platform is. Teams who have never met all of their team members face-to-face, and some of us now are hiring people virtually. Some staff move on, you've got vacancies. Each team member then you've got to sort of induct and on board virtually, and they're going to be a harder time in developing that social cohesion. So to build this and to see the positive effects, the session has to be a little bit more than a meet and greet. Here is Barbara. Meet Barbara today, everyone. You really need to think about what it means in practice. So focus on improving social relations, clarifying roles, investing time and effort in activities such as sharing expectations from the team, getting to know one another, anticipating how you're going to handle conflict, scheduling periodic calls has both a positive effect on social cohesion and trust in the virtual world. Now, as leaders of virtual teams, you must also protect the team from negative behaviour. A key factor for trust is believing that others have good intentions. And in virtual teams, it's enough for just one team member to engage in any negative behaviour, say, for example, dishonest communication, that the trust team can rapidly decrease. And you know, there's truth in this adage that trust arrives on foot but leaves on horseback. So if one team member intentionally tries to sort of do something with it, kind of deceiving others, their good intention can no longer be assumed. We as leaders should detect this early and correct intentional dishonest communication. And differentiate it, of course, from unintentional misinformation, which often happens where people send something unintentionally, and then highlight and explain if that in fact was the case. So if there are any rumours, just shut them down quickly. And be mindful about sharing negative feedback virtually. So another key element on building trust and having that trust in the team is believing that team members have the ability to perform well. So trust that they're going to do their jobs, even though they're out of sight, out of mind. You don't necessarily need to be checking in with them all the time. Now, if the team isn't performing as expected and the team members start to believe in their own confidence being challenged, then trust is likely to decline. And whilst it may be important to give feedback, be mindful about when this is truly necessary. And if it is, be very specific and not link it to the whole team as a whole. Sort of deal with individuals on a one-on-one basis rather than the whole group. Now, if teams are to be more than the sum of their parts and be really effective, they must be able to use individuals' knowledge and expertise benefit for the team. So to do so, team members must be able to share information effectively with one another. And the evidence shows that for this, the more this happens, of course, the better the team performs. And sharing information helps develop a common understanding of team's goals and tasks, but it also does lend itself to building that trust and social cohesion further. Now, despite its importance, research evidence shows that virtual teams are actually less effective at sharing information. And while members of virtual teams share more uniquely held information, in general, they share less information overall than people who meet face-to-face. So in particular, they refrain from sharing information about how to work together, how to manage social issues, focusing instead on what's strictly related to solving the problem or the task at hand. And ironically, it's information about working together and connecting with team members on a social level that's more important to the performance of virtual teams. So making an effort to share this will more benefit the virtual team's performance. Now, one way to support information sharing is building what's known as a transactive memory system, or a TMS. A TMS, transactive memory system, which is why I prefer to just call it TMS. Now, TMS within a team actually refers to the knowledge that's embedded in a team's collective memory. So imagine, that your team has got multiple individuals that have all got a memory bank, a brain's trust, and a collective memory. Bringing that all together is like an indexing system which tells the team which team members know what. And if you build this TMS within a team, it generally really improves team performance. But virtual teams are less likely to develop one. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, but the other indirect interactions between members as well. So, you've got the physical and the temporal distance and the lack of past collaboration. So if people haven't collaborated before, and of course, it's not just within our teams now, it's with other organizations too, isn't it? The lack of the impact of the lack of communication through if it's mainly through email, then it really will impact on the result of the team's interactions, and also if you're conversing with other teams outside of your organization as well. So you're going to have less exposure to information about other teams' knowledge and expertise if we don't actually make a considered effort to think about how we're going to share it. May seem obvious when I say it, right? So let's proactively do this, yeah? Proactively diversify the information that you share with the team. So to counteract this tendency of virtual teams to only focus on task-related information, which is, you know, what am I going to do today to get me to A to B? Or if I'm communicating with another team, what do they need to do for me? We as leaders should set aside the time explicitly to ask our virtual teams to share their feedback and expectations about how the team should collaborate during their work. Having standalone sessions dedicated to non-work related information is going to help your teams build connection. And by preparing these sessions in advance and guiding them as leaders and managers, we can ensure people are comfortable joining them and the topics are appropriate. So let me flip back to that transactive memory system. So as a leader and a manager, you can help this by clarifying team members' expertise, by having them share their past relevant experiences, identifying how they can contribute to a team's tasks and collaboration. And this helps other members of the team know then who possesses what information to ask the right people to get it when they need it. Also set rules about who needs to know what in a virtual team based on their expertise. If one team member serves as a technical expert, when other people find out information related to that expertise, they will then share it with the expert. And specialization also helps to, free up team members and free up resources, because not everybody needs to hold on and use all the information they come across. But it's good to know who has certain key information that you can go to very, very quickly, particularly if you've got new staff members coming in and you know that it is in fact Michelle is the one that owns the information and the background on a particular project that you're running in the organization. Now, virtual teams can benefit from tools to support their transactive memory systems, such as databases of knowledge. We all, are pretty good at looking, if we want to know something about a TV show, we'll kind of go up to Google, and then it'll come up on Wikipedia, everything you need to know about every, days of our lives. Well, it's kind of the same when we're building this up within our teams. Yeah, let's build up that wiki, that reference point. So as leaders and managers, you can transfer really good practices within your own team, but also within other teams in the organization to help accelerate the process of finding a suitable tool to support their shared knowledge. How many staff members have you known sit in isolation with a problem and then go searching for an answer? And they might search organizationally, they might search externally. Whereas as if you're quite intentional about where you house that transactional knowledge, then it saves them a lot of time in getting to a solution. So you're building that data of knowledge within each of your teams. The other thing you can do too is hold debriefing sessions, and the effects of information sharing and using this TMS are supported by moments when the team reflects upon their goals, collaboration, decision-making processes, and internal communication. Making such moments deliberate and grouping them in dedicated sessions accelerates the positive impact on your team's effectiveness. So you might have all just come together and put a proposal together, put a tender together, and you've gone through this intense process. Debrief afterwards. And the debrief should be focusing on learning and improvement rather than evaluation and judgment. So it's a little bit different, a debrief than and in such settings, managers should share their feedback with the team to allow it to discover the lessons learned. So a developmental, non-punitive focus not only yields more honest and accurate feedback, but of course it enhances our experiential learning. And as a manager, schedule your debriefing session after a specific deliverable was completed or a significant milestone has been achieved by the team. And it should really be focused on specific activities, episodes, or events rather than performance or results in general. So make it topic specific, something you all did together, and you have that debrief session. And of course, should be informed by a variety of perspectives and evidence sources. For example, the review should include input from multiple participants and at least one additional source of evidence, for example, organizational data. Now, besides solving a task at hand, teams also need to know how to work together or how to engage in teamwork in order to be more effective. And the research shows that training is actually a really good way to enhance teamwork, and teaching team members about the importance of social support within the team, or promoting ways to manage interpersonal conflict among teammates. So the evidence has shown that teams, including virtual ones, who go through teamwork training actually outperform those who don't. Because sometimes we have a thing about teamwork training, don't we? And it feels a bit odd. It's not like we can all kind of go up to the Dandenongs right now and go up the 1,000 steps. So, but you can actually do some engage in some teamwork training together. And there's also better ways, if you do this, to avoid miscommunication then, and of course, which could result in sort of some dysfunctional conflict. So teams can be trained or developed in 4 different ways. Now, there's the old classroom style teaching, or now an online webinar. The other 2 is an interactive workshop, which also you can do online. We've been doing a bit of that today. We're going to go into a breakout session. So these are all things and tools that you can use with your teams if you can't physically meet in this world to sort of do a bit of teamwork training. 3, there are simulations with tryouts and practice. And 4, your team developing action plans based on in-situ reviews. So that is monitoring and reviewing the team's work as tasks are performed. So there's 4 different ways there that you can help do that teamwork training. And while 4 methods help teams perform better, of course, the interactive and the experiential formats work better than a lecture on teamwork. So listening to Lisa on a Friday, whilst you hopefully think it's fabulous, it's never going to replace actually working through a problem together. So if this is what the research tells us that you can share with your team, how do we embed it into practice? So let's think about content. So one possible focus of teamwork training is something like coordination, which can consist of a couple of elements. So how much effort your team members make to manage shared resources, how coherent and logistically consistent team members' work activities are. And the research confirms that coordination is really important for virtual teams' performance. So who on the team tracks progress and tasks, who accounts for outcomes that meld team together, and who doesn't, so that then you can obviously help those who don't understand who's doing the coordination for the progress and the tasks of the teams. And what's more, virtual teams can benefit from coordinating communication as well. So for instance, how often you communicate, how quickly people are expected to answer, how explicit the message and the feedback are. All these things are important to sort of talk to teams about, particularly when you're in the virtual world, you know. I know that sometimes when you're a new leader and you've got teams reporting to you, they don't know what the expectation is that you might have to respond to an email. Is it an hour? Is it 5 hours? Is it a week? And sometimes it's really important to make that very explicit, particularly when you don't have the value of face-to-face in the real world, but in the virtual world. So engaging teams face-to-face, ensuring coordination of their activities. Sometimes it's normally the leader's task. You might feel it's all incumbent on you, but you might find in the virtual world that some of your team members might prefer a high degree of autonomy, and you might all sort of say, right, we'll coordinate all of our own work, but come together then to share how we've done that. But it is vital for teams, virtual teams performance. So having people be able to compensate for your role a bit too, and training the team to work that way is actually really vital in their effectiveness. So the The REA has highlighted that virtual teams should set up teamwork training sessions. Tick. It's also highlighted that you should clarify roles, including that of your role and the manager in the virtual world, and making sure that you coordinate who's doing particular roles in the team. The other thing is have those tools for coordination. So things that you might use, many of us use Microsoft 365, you might use a tool like Planner, so that you can coordinate who's doing what in terms of teams and activities, and make sure everyone has access to those tools. And also coordinate the team's communication. So like I was saying, have those expectations spelled out about how often you're going to have those meetings, how long what's your expectation of responding to emails, what's your expectation of responding to certain activities. Now, personally for me and the team that reports to me, my executive, when we met in person, we'd meet once a week. But since we've been in COVID time, we actually started off at the beginning meeting 3 times per week. But since then, we've now gone to 2 times per week and then have as required meetings as well. But we're very explicit about the tasks and the functions and how we share knowledge when we're at those meetings. And it's come as no surprise, as we come to the end of my presentation, that leadership is a really relevant factor to weigh in the performance of virtual teams. However, the evidence is less decisive on how virtual teams are best led. So the evidence indicates that in virtual teams that only communicate through lean media, which is emails, the leadership style adopted by the team leader might make a difference in how the team leader works and performs. On the one hand, and you might identify certain leadership styles here, a transactional leader who's focused on the task and gives that direction may keep the team concentrated on the task, making them coordinate better to solve a problem and produce more outputs, and we've all come across these leaders that are very directional and transactional, and this follows this, follows this, let me see you do this, that, and the other. On the other hand, there are transformational leaders as well, and they tend to focus more on vision, ask the team members for input. They might take risks a bit more. They might do the things that enhance social cohesion and improve the team's creativity and the quality of the results. But whether you're one or the other, or whether you're a bit of both, one of the most important characteristics if you're going to be the leader of a virtual team, and I would say of any team, would be to have humility. And humility, as a reminder, is being self-aware, willing to learn, having appreciation for others, and being focused on them instead of on you. Now, all these qualities allow a humble leader to make team members feel more psychologically safe. And in teams high in psychological safety, people believe their teammates will always give them the benefit of the doubt if they do take a risk. And as a consequence, they'll take more constructive risks, such as sharing ideas with the team, discussing mistakes, and asking for and receiving feedback. So, to sum up, the research from the Centre for Evidence-Based Management set out to assess the evidence on what makes virtual teams effective. We conducted this rapid evidence assessment, which included 10 meta-analyses and 35 high-quality single studies. And in looking at the attributes of effective virtual teams through this lens of the scientific literature, it sought to summarize the results and their implications of how to equip managers to develop the most efficient and effective virtual teams. And when seen through the lens of a global pandemic, it becomes even more obvious that virtual teams are now a necessity in today's work environment, and they're going to continue to be, I would say, for years to come. But there are more challenges to overcome when you're leading a virtual team. And to mitigate these challenges, virtual teams should make use of rich media, such as our video conferencing that we're doing today, so you can communicate, but also use it to focus on those things such as social cohesion and building trust. Being deliberate in sharing information also helps virtual teams function and perform better, especially if they can build that transactive memory system so you can store that knowledge that people can access easily. And besides directing all attention to tasks, virtual teams can also gain from learning how to work better together and coordinating your team efforts. And while the evidence is less concrete on whether there's a certain leadership style that works through this medium, it is those leaders who are humble and help members of their virtual teams to feel psychologically safe that will end up taking more constructive risks. And I think that is a really important thing for our sector.